Awesome, it's 5 o'clock, so we'll get started. Hi, I'm Anna Marquise, and I'm the Acting Director. Welcome to the People's Review Live, hosted by us, the Equality State Policy Center. We are a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization working to improve the lives of all Wyoming's people through transparent government, fair elections, and thriving communities. The People's Review Live is designed to help people across Wyoming engage with our government and keep up with important issues and debates. When we work together, we can ensure transparent government, fair elections, and thriving communities. And that's never been more important than it is right now. This event is made possible thanks to the generous support of our People's Review Live Leadership Circle members, Marcia Kunstill and Joe Albright, Joanne Skeen True and Shane True, Mike Shaunsey and Kathy Jenkins, and an anonymous donor. If you'd like to know how to become a Leadership Circle member, please email me, and you can find my email in the chat or on our website. I'll hand it over to Jen and get us started.
All right, thanks, Anna. Thanks to everybody who is joining us as participants. And thanks especially to this panel. We're pretty excited to be able to have this conversation today. Before I introduce them and we dig into the questions, just a little bit of housekeeping. In spite of the fact that we are now well into year 2 of virtual time, and everybody is something of a Zoom expert, we want to just reiterate, this is webinar format. You should be able to see and hear all of us. If you cannot see us or hear us, please hit Anna up in the chat. She is going to be your tech person who is going to fix that for you. She's also going to be putting some key information in the chat as we go. And also, because we're in that webinar format, we're going to host this discussion amongst our panelists, but we really invite you to put your questions in the chat. We'll do our best to get to those questions depending on our time. And if you have anything else come up that you need our help with, Anna is going to be able to help you out. So first, really quickly, I also want to extend apologies from Mayor Matt Hall. He is tied up right now in a Wyoming Association of Municipalities meeting, sends his regards and his regrets, and we are hoping that he may be able to join us in the last few minutes and maybe wax philosophic to take us out to the top of the hour. We'll see. But in the meantime, we have a really incredibly impressive panel. All of these folks have been on the governor's strike team, and we're about to find out more about what that means. So thanks to them for joining us. I'm going to go quickly through their bios. And they're going to correct me right off the top if I get something wrong. So Robin Cooley is the director of the Wyoming Department of Workforce Services. Director Cooley has also received gubernatorial appointments to the Wyoming State Board of Equalization to hear and decide various mineral and property tax disputes, which sounds scintillating, and thank you for doing that service, and the Wyoming Public Service Commission, where she was a public utility regulator. She spent 18 years with the Wyoming Attorney General's office and also served as Deputy Attorney General of the Human Services Division. She's been an adjunct professor where she taught business law, and I'm sorry, I should have said at Laramie County Community College, and legal research and writing in the paralegal program. She's also taught public health law as an adjunct professor at the University of Wyoming College of Law. And welcome, Director Cooley. Thank you for joining us. And what I also should have said is she was appointed in 2019 by Governor Mark Gordon. Director Corin Schmidt was also appointed in 2019 by Governor Mark Gordon. She is the director of the Wyoming Department of Family Services. She previously served as the deputy director for the Wyoming Department of Health. A Wyoming native, she received her undergrad and grad degrees from the University of Wyoming. And after living up and down the Rocky Mountains, she settled in Cheyenne, where she's worked for the last 18 years at the state level in health and human services, mostly in policy and administration. And her passion is serving vulnerable adults, children, and families. And she feels fortunate her work allows her to do that. I feel fortunate that she is in the state doing that on our behalf. So welcome to you, Director Schmidt. And Jim Willocks was first elected a Converse County Commissioner in November of 2006 and has been active in the WCCA, that's the Wyoming County Commissioners Association, ever since. He's now the president of the WCCA. And before serving as WCCA president, he served as the treasurer, vice president, chairman of the Transportation Committee. He's a 4th generation Converse County resident and grew up on a family ranch south of Douglas. He tells us that in 2001, the family sold the ranch and moved to town, where he and his wife are now small business owners. He's also a UW grad, and he has been a WHSAA basketball official for 20 years. Did I get that right, Jim?
Yeah, that's the
Awesome.
high school association. Yep.
Okay, thank you. I did
I
not
can
know
be
that.
yelled at about anywhere in the state.
Perfect. Well, there will be no yelling here today. So what we really are excited to lift up today and talk about with these folks, these experts, is the governor's proposal for Wyoming's future and the Survive, Drive, and Thrive report. And in that report, it says what the state, they're looking at what the state needed to do to survive, what could be done better to drive to a future where all Wyoming can thrive. And part of the reason we're so interested in this subject is because it ties closely with ESPC's mission, as Anna highlighted, which our work here at ESPC is to improve the lives of all of Wyoming's people through transparent government, fair elections, and thriving communities. So there's a significant overlap, and that's why we're really excited for this conversation. Plus, we get to spend an hour with these experts. So I'm going to start out with you, Director Schmidt. Can you talk a little bit more about how the report came about and how the strike team came together?
So thank you first for inviting us and giving us the opportunity to speak about this, because this is a pretty exciting part of being involved in this larger conversation about Wyoming's future. So during the pandemic, and as there's been a lot of federal conversations about incentivizing states and helping states address pandemic issues, but also looking towards some sort of economic recovery, the governor started pretty early on talking about what are we going to look like once this is all over? What are the opportunities do we have that we can take advantage of now to be able to shape Wyoming's future, understanding that the pandemic put us in a place of tough economic times. Certainly the nature of our state as it responded to a pandemic was really difficult in our small communities, our schools, our workplaces, our childcare centers. So he asked a group of us to get together and start to think about what is it that we can do now to start preparing for recovery. And then not even just recovery, but getting to a place of where we're really thriving. So the survive phase was really just that. We're in it, we still need to manage it, we still have to address it, but there will be a time where we're going to be able to move forward, and he wanted us to be thinking about that with his office in terms of what's some really good thinking and opportunity promotion that we can do that will just not help us get out of the pandemic, but to really push through the pandemic and come out on the other side with some levels of excellence.
Thank you for that overview. And I'm curious, Commissioner Wilcox, who was on the strike team? What were the roles that people played? I know we have two department heads here. I know you represent the counties. Can you give us sort of a lay of the land?
Yeah, again, thanks for having us today. It is exciting to look forward with this. I represent the counties. Mayor Hall represent the cities as kind of the government closest to the people that would be implementing some of this. You've got two of the directors on board. We also had legislative members. Legislative leadership was on there. Randy McKay, the policy director for the governor, was on board. And then Meredith Acey was kind of our coordinator to keep us going on that. And I'm trying to think if I'm missing another director. You guys help me if I'm missing one.
Josh Durrell.
Josh, okay, and then business council. And so the idea was, and the agency heads, of course, worked a lot together on stuff, offline some because they're on a regular communication basis there. But what I really have to commend the governor for is recognizing to bring local government to the table, because we are in this together, but we're all kind of battling separately together. It's, we've all got our each individual things, but the governor has been very good about recognizing that counties and municipalities are dealing with a lot of the stuff on the ground and are many times the first line. And then we can sometimes the state is working it down to us, and sometimes we're bringing it up to the state, those concerns that we've had, whether it's some of the other topics we're going to talk about, childcare or workforce development or housing assistance or recreation, even these things that are all possible as we look forward to enhance the quality of life in Wyoming. But that was a group we've met not in person. We're all doing Zoom. And so those have worked pretty good. But trying to bring in the executive branch, legislative branch, and then those local government entities is really the vision that the governor had to bring us to the table and look for solutions.
I appreciate that overview. I also appreciate the distinction between the executive branch and the legislative branch, the department heads, and then the government on the local level. So we're really glad that there's some representation across this panel to talk more about that. Director Cooley, I want to talk for a minute about kind of CARES and ARPA funds, since those pieces from the federal government to incentivize states and help with the recovery that Director Schmidt mentioned are kind of the backbone, it appears, of the survive and drive phases. Correct me if I'm wrong on that. But can you talk to us a little bit about what those funds are and how they relate to the plan?
Sure. And again, I would echo Director Schmidt, and thank you for having us here to explain this a little bit more and just speak to it in some generalized terms so that the state of Wyoming and the stakeholders know the process in this. So CARES Act and ARPA Act. So initially, as you know, the state received the CARES Act, and that's Coronavirus Aid, Relief, and Economic Security Act. Those funds, unfortunately, they've been used very strategically and thoughtfully by the governor and by the legislature across the state for the needs of the state, really in that survive mode. What did we need immediately in order to deal with pandemic issues and just survive through that phase? But as you know, or as you may have heard, those funds really had a lot of parameters around them in terms of how they could be used, which made it difficult when you wanted to look a little bit outside of that, recognizing that it might not have been directly COVID and pandemic related, but there was a connection to that. So I think it really limited how those funds could be used. So now we have the ARPA Act funds, which is the American Rescue Plan Act. And I always have to look down at what those are to remember them, because I always don't know if it's rescue or recovery, and I get those mixed up. But those funds, I think my understanding is they're a little bit broader in scope in terms of how they can be used. So I think that's the difference between them, and the difference in how they can be used around the state. And that's why we're looking at all of these various areas. And that's really the beauty of the governor's plan with the Survive, Drive, and Thrive. These funds can be used. They have to be obligated by the 2024 and then completely used by 2026. But so we've got some time. The CARES Act funds were time limited as well. So there was just a really quick emergency need to get those funds out into our communities in Wyoming. And the state did a wonderful job of doing that. But we have some time to plan with these ARPA funds. So that's the beauty of the governor's Survive, Drive, and Thrive plan is we're developing this plan with all of these, with the stakeholders around the state in order to really look at what do we want Wyoming to look like in the future? How are we going to spend those funds now for the future of Wyoming?
And Jen, if I can expand it, the thing that's unique about the CARES and the ARP funding is we're kind of focusing on the state level right now, but note that there was funding in CARES that went directly to local governments, counties and cities, schools and hospitals all received money directly or almost direct pass through. And on the CARES funding, we basically used kind of a SLIB approach. We made applications and we went to basically the state land board with the 5 elected officials with applications for what we thought was important. Hospitals did it, local governments did that. And that worked well, but it all had to be done by the end of December. ARP with the more time also looks like it actually can be used for revenue replacement, which means if you exchange dollars, you actually have a way to really broadly use those for those things that, as Robin was just saying, they were COVID adjacent, but were really important that didn't fit the first time, but might the second time. And weird ones are your emergency manager guy might have needed a new pickup because he's driving hundreds of miles delivering stuff, but is that really a CARES expenditure? Well, it was needed. And those are the kind of technical questions that the SLIB and the CARES Acting funding had. So know that the task force is really looking first at what the state's dollars can do, and then how do we leverage what goes to local governments and pair it with ARPA funding, possibly the infrastructure bill that's out there. So we're trying to also look a little holistic, even though the local governments have some of their own money, as well as schools and hospitals again. So there's a lot of moving parts.
Well, and I appreciate that point, Commissioner Wilcox, because I think that the ARPA funds, as they've started to come out and we've started to see what Treasury guidance looks like, Director Cooley, great point that there's a much longer window, her time horizon to deploy them. So there's the opportunity to be more strategic. And then going back to your point, Commissioner Wilcox, that there are really specific earmarks for capital funds, for K-12 education, for higher education, and for towns and counties. And so if I'm not mistaken, it's something like $1.068 billion coming into the state through ARPA. And then something like another 182 million that's coming to the towns and counties. Am I in the ballpark? I'm not getting tons of nods, but I'm not getting anybody saying,
So.
okay.
That's pretty close.
I think that's
Okay.
close.
I hate it at the top of the hour when the panelists say, no, you're completely wrong, that doesn't go well, but so I'd love to dig into, I appreciate your willingness to contextualize what the different phases are and how CARES really got us through that survive phase, got those dollars out the door, really stabilized the state. Can we talk a little bit about the drive section? Because this is where it feels like you're starting to get into the meat of where we are now or where we're going in the near term. And that first goal listed in the drive section is about attracting working families and young adults to Wyoming, to raise their families, to keep them in the state. And I'm really curious because you're coming from very different perspectives, what your individual organization or department can do to facilitate and attract and retain young workers. Can we start with you, Director Schmidt, and talk about what Department of Family Services, what role you play in this?
Yes, absolutely. And our role is very interesting in terms of the whole Drive and Thrive, because we are a human services agency. And so our mission, our values are really about supporting people, about keeping families safe at home, and supporting our communities and the folks who work with so many of those vulnerable families and giving them what they need. So when we come to the table, we're thinking really about human services and health, basically healthy communities, right? Both from a human standpoint and a health standpoint. So when we think about what is it that families want and need, sometimes they need resources, right? Sometimes they may find themselves in a crisis situation where they need to have access to something. And that's very much a part of what we're looking at in terms of building healthy communities and also helping communities to develop some of their own resiliency. I think what we learned through COVID is that we are an incredible, and we've known this, I mean, we're Wyoming, right? But we saw it play out. So we're very much interested in sustaining some of those systems that people relied on when times did get difficult and when they did need some sort of crisis intervention, whether it's food, whether it's shelter, those types of things. Because when a family can meet its basic needs, everybody does well. So what we're looking at then are what are those basic needs? How do we reinforce the systems that provide those basic needs? And then how do we, the exciting part of our participation in this conversation is then also using that to support economic development, supporting workforce training, because any movement in that area helps our families as well. So we need to see good jobs. We need to see young families staying and raising their families because that's good for everyone. And so connecting with those systems in a different way has really been an amazing opportunity through the conversations to say, let's talk about childcare, because we can talk about childcare in terms of need and with assistance, but we also need to talk about childcare in terms of quality for any family who's looking for childcare. They need to access it. It needs to be available. That's not just for vulnerable families, that's for all families. So that's a lot of the role that we're taking in addition to so many conversations around health. And that is probably a whole webinar on its own. But
it always is a whole webinar on its own when we dig into health. But I think that you've teed up the question really well for you, Director Cooley, in terms of what role does your department in terms of workforce services play, and how does it complement the work that other departments are doing to advance that goal?
Well, and I'm the lead for education and workforce. And so the point I want to make there though, and it taps right into what Director Schmidt said, there's so much overlap and so much integration of these parts and pieces. You have to have the childcare setting and the childcare infrastructure, right, in order to lift up these families so that they can go out and get the education, they can go out and be in the workforce. So it all fits together like somewhat of a pyramid just sometimes. But when in looking at the education and workforce component and how do we work with families and young people and keep them in the state, what we need to start with and what we're looking at is starting through at the K through 12. How do we get young kids interested in career and technical ed, for instance? How do we get them into some of the areas they might be interested in while they're in high school and give them that opportunity through a work experience opportunity, an internship, an apprenticeship, a pre-apprenticeship, all of these opportunities. And then you track that then chronologically into the community college system and UW. And are we making sure that we are aligning our education with what industry is telling us they need? Because when you have somebody that's going to graduate from community college or UW, if they can step out into a good job in Wyoming that is available to them and they can raise a family in Wyoming, they're going to be much more likely to stay. So that is integrating all of that education and recognizing from industry what we need, what the workforce needs are, and putting them together to make sure we've got that continuum to benefit everyone in Wyoming and keep them here if we can.
Well, and I so appreciate you highlighting that alignment between education, workforce, economic development. And Commissioner Wilcox, I'd be really curious your thoughts. How does this play out on the ground in local communities? That's the vantage point that you have. And I think that's a really important perspective to have.
Well, I think that the takeaway here is there's no silver bullet. I mean, it is economic development in which is really the end goal, because if you've got that, how do you get to that? How do you create jobs that keep families around and all those things that come around it is a process, not an event. And so we're going to chip away. I tell people, I hope we can get bunt singles, several times. We're not going to hit home runs, but if we can get bunt singles and advance it. And so what we try to see at the local level is working with economic development groups. And most communities have a small economic development group that then works with the business council. But then you have to tie it back into child care and workforce development. So then you work with the junior college in your community, in Douglas and Converse County. So we've got a branch EWC. So we have those conversations about what can we do for workforce training. But it's circular in its reference. So what do you need first to get that? And I think that's the challenge we all face. But when you talk about big ideas as part of what this Survive, Drive, Thrive was, we talked about childcare and education. One of the big ideas is can we develop childcare next to our junior colleges? How do we maybe make that an opportunity? Now, it may not fit in this box of ARP money or CARES money, but there's the kind of ideas. Director Schmidt was talking about childcare, and then Director Cooley's talking about education. Well, if we happen to be able to build childcare right next to the junior college, we may be able to have an opportunity there. A lot of big businesses in Wyoming are providing childcare as a benefit. You see that particularly in health and schools. Have a lot of employees there. They're bringing that in. So that's how it plays on the ground. Is we're visiting with all those different people, trying to, move the ball forward a little bit at a time. Every once in a while we get lucky and hit a big one, but that's what's both frustrating and the real view is it's not today we will, we just keep chipping away on it. We're not going to see the results immediately. And I think that is something that people that want things to happen and for Wyoming to move forward, we're all a little impatient, but we've got some great things on the horizon, whether they're tied to ARP or not. You could go down the list of good things that are happening, and then how do we capitalize on those? And that was a big circle to say it's all integrated. I don't have the silver bullet. That was kind of the circle.
Jen, if I can add to that too, another component of this is the economic business and economic development component part of this. And I know what they're looking at and what they've been looking at even before this were the amenities in our communities and, really enhancing those amenities. And that's another thing for our young folks, our young adults and our families. Those are another enticement to stay in the community. So I just wanted to throw out there's another couple of legs to this stool also.
Well, it seems like I appreciate that addition, because it seems like there are a number of legs to the stool, and just generally making the point that this is going to be incremental progress, I think, is a really important component of the discussion. I don't happen to believe in silver bullets, so I appreciate you bringing that up, Commissioner Wilcox. But I think that this incremental approach, and knowing that we might make little bits of progress is a helpful context. And Director Schmidt, knowing that childcare continues to come up as this really important component of workforce development, attracting and retaining families, does childcare generally fall under the purview of your departments? How does it sort of fit into the departments? And then how might we kind of carry that forward to address the childcare fragility that the report brings up?
Yeah, that's an interesting question because, we're a state agency and we manage programs, right? But then we also have an interest in the larger systems issues. So from a technical standpoint, our involvement in childcare is really around childcare licensing. So safety is a big focus of ours. And then we provide assistance to childcare centers on behalf of families who need financial assistance. So we're kind of a safety net in a lot of respects to the basic infrastructure childcare needs, the childcare system needs, safety. But then we partner with the Department of Workforce Services. We partner with private entities around ideas around quality. What does a quality childcare center look like, or a childcare, early care and education? Because it really isn't just about having a kid within a given situation where they're safe. You want them to have an experience that helps them to develop as little people into school-age people into larger people. So we really do see ourselves as one component of a larger system, but we think we play a really important role in just providing some of those basic services. With that, though, we do have an interest in building out those services because we know all families need them. And it goes back to what I was saying. Even though we only fund maybe certain components of it, only have responsibility for certain components of it, we're interested in the larger system because that helps communities. And at the end of the day, healthy communities are going to help any of the families that we serve. So it's been an opportunity, certainly, to get involved in a way that maybe is beyond what we've typically done in terms of our involvement. But there's some wonderful partners out there that are very much interested in advocating on behalf of early care and education. And we feel fortunate that we get to work alongside them. I do want to kind of come back, though, to a little bit of the ARPA, because I think this is really where there's another interesting intersection. So while the money that we're talking about today under Drive and Thrive is the money that the state's getting, we also, through the course of the last year or so, have received and will be receiving like $60 million directly from the federal government for child care and early care and education issues. So again, while we're not necessarily going to be looking at the ARPA funding, what we want to do is to take the money that we have been allocated and use it to complement the larger activities around Drive and Thrive. So this isn't just about thinking about how to spend the money that the state got. It's also about wisely being able to grow the program and to reinforce the program using the money that we've received in order to continue to really leverage maximize the leverage that we can of any of the funds that are coming our way.
Well, and I've heard all of you now talk about how we leverage the funds, how we really think strategically, and how we take the experience that we've had over the past year or so and carry ourselves strongly into the future. Before we start really looking forward and getting into the next bids, Director Cooley, I'd love for your perspective to come into this about how the lack of childcare affected workers and businesses, and what that might mean for how we advance a plan that picks up on some of the pieces we've already talked about.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that. During this past year and a half, you've all heard the discussion in news articles about why people aren't returning to work. We've had, after businesses started opening up, and we had open hiring signs all up and down Main Street, Wyoming. I saw them myself traveling across the state. And the question was, are they not returning to work because they're getting more in unemployment federal pandemic benefits, or are there other reasons? And we've not ever gotten sufficient data to track that down. And I have yet to read an article that was well researched that indicates what that actual reason was. But I do know what we are hearing from claimants is they have to make this decision about childcare. Is there quality childcare out there? That is a big factor in determining whether you are even able to go back to work. If we had individuals that were sent home from school and they were doing virtual schooling, again, it's not childcare, but it's a schooling issue, and it is a child caring for your child type of issue. So I think that played in a huge role into getting into that decision making about whether people were actually able to return to work. And of course, another consideration, there are many other considerations, if you had sick individuals at home, or if you yourself were immunocompromised or what have you. But childcare was definitely one of those top factors that people had to consider. And when we had childcare centers closed, what do you do as a parent? You really, your hands are tied. So yes, that's, like I said, I kind of think of that as one of those baseline pyramid infrastructure components to this that we've got to that we've got to assist, so that young families, so that all families can adequately return to work, or if they want to, they can continue their education, whatever the circumstance might be, but they're free to do that without that particular barrier holding them back.
If I can, Jen,
Please.
the one thing that is interesting about this, and I don't want to dismiss that childcare isn't important because it's very critical. Well, remember, that's a set of workers that are that 35 and 40 and younger. And then we've got an older workforce in Wyoming that we also have to look at the other half of the equation as we get towards retirement age. And those people at the peak of their careers in their 40s to 50s that aren't dealing with the childcare issue. And so as we try to build Wyoming, we've got this spectrum we need to work with, and childcare is absolutely critical for the first part of the spectrum to get young people here and maybe get them to stay, because we are established families, if you will, are middle age, and if you look at our demographics, we are trending older, and that is not healthy in the long term. So I don't want to dismiss that, but we're also got to look at that ties together, that there is more than childcare is critical, but it's not the only thing that is essential for us building some of this, but it's absolutely critical. And then the other thing that, and Director Schmidt alluded to it a little bit, that's key to how we're going to use ARPA and CARES funding, and the governor made it very clear, is we have to make sure the programs we stand up are sustainable. It's easy to spend one-time money, and we had a chunk of that, and it was critical, and it got us through some important things. That's the real challenge, and is the economic condition of Wyoming is a little turbulent right now, maybe leveling out with some activity, but it's still uncertain. So we can stand up a new program, that's easy, but how do we sustain it when this ARPA money disappears? And so that's the other thing that I think is really critical, that people have talked about, on the street, say, hey, why don't you do this? Well, that works and we can do it for 2 years, but is that enough or right? And I don't think anybody has that answer yet on what programs are we able to sustain after we stand them up, or is it really going to be investment, and I'll use the term in infrastructure, that baseline stuff that's kind of a one-time expense that sets us up to be successful moving forward? And that's no easy answer there.
Well, and so you're exactly right that initial investment in infrastructure is really going to set us up for the long term, not just be, an easy way to get dollars out the door. And it strikes me that you've all made the case for why childcare is a really important component of that infrastructure. And you're right, Commissioner Wilcox, like there's obviously a big spectrum of workers. There's a big spectrum of folks who work in the state. Some of them need childcare as infrastructure. And I think that takes us over to broadband, which the the report talks about in a number of places, and it is certainly, we saw over the last year, really essential components of how we make sure that our communities move through the drive and thrive phases. It was pretty important in a lot of ways, including this sort of webinar format for the survive phase. But I think that also the last year kind of revealed the gaps, not only in the childcare infrastructure, but also in the broadband infrastructure. So I'd be curious if you'd all like to comment on how it can help businesses, how it can help deliver services from your departments, and how it can maybe help us overcome some of the challenges of the geography of our state. Director Cooley, would you mind taking a stab at that?
Absolutely. And it wasn't something that was really directly in our face in terms of how it impacted us. But I can tell you, throughout the pandemic, we were the only state that our 20 workforce centers across the state, we stayed open. Governor Gordon requested that we be open because he knew that individuals out in our rural communities were not going to be able to get online to apply for unemployment benefits and to apply for jobs once those unemployment benefits ran out. We had such an increase in walk-in service, individuals during that time frame. It was truly incredible, and a large part of that reason was because these individuals couldn't do that at home and adequately get through that process with their internet service. So that's just an example of a gap that we never really thought of, to be real, quite honest with you. But being open was the only way those individuals, and having a place to come in to sit down to a computer, that was the only way those individuals were going to be able to get through to get those benefits.
And so, Director Schmidt, what would you propose we do? I don't mean to make you into a broadband expert or, send you out there digging lines to run broadband across the state, but was that part of the discussion at all? And what are your thoughts on how we move that forward?
Well, I know that broadband's been an ongoing conversation, and I think what this has done is just given a little bit more push to think a little more concretely about it. So we've had, these ideal conversations, and from an agency standpoint, it is pretty difficult because the broadband community is also stuck with some of those last miles, that there's enough people in a given area to provide a lot of service. But when you're starting to reach out to the ranches, when you're starting to reach out to communities where there's only a few people, kind of like telephones back in the day, the cost is increased exponentially, right? And so I do think that there is an interesting dilemma the whole broadband community is struggling with. And I know that there's some concerted efforts around with the legislature and task forces to really think about what is a fair and reasonable approach to access, and what does that mean? From an agency standpoint, from our agency standpoint, and certainly from like the Department of Health and the healthcare standpoint, the access to broadband, and I think maybe a little bit more of the comfort we've developed around this kind of technology has been incredible. From a child welfare standpoint, we were still able to do visits. I mean, a lot of people have cell phones, so we could check on children, we could work with families, and we could visually get eyes on. Certainly it wasn't ideal in terms of being able to get into the homes, and we were, if we needed to, we were there. But it did give a different level of engagement with families that we hadn't really experienced before, and we found out it worked pretty well. So there is, I think, this idea about where does this environment now fit in our lives? I think it fits very squarely in our lives, complemented by what Director Cooley was saying, that you still have to have some availability of in-person services, because there's just going to be some people who are going to need a different type of interaction in order to get what they need. But from an educational standpoint, from a human services standpoint, from a telehealth standpoint, there's a little bit of silver lining to this pandemic cloud that forced us into this environment that I don't think we would have really gone into willingly, but now we know it, and I think we'll be able to take much better advantage of it.
Well, and I agree that we've been forced into it. It seems strange given our geography that we probably weren't a little more well-versed in it. We're all, I think, a little more well-versed in, driving 5 hours to get to a meeting and going to the meeting and then driving home. But now maybe we have some more options. So that's a benefit. Commissioner Wilcox, what does it look like in terms of broadband and connectivity and that last mile concept that Director Schmidt was talking about from your perspective at the county level?
Yeah, I now know where the mute button is. 18 months ago, I had no idea how to mute and unmute. So you don't hear that near as often in these meetings as you do. Can you hear me? Am I on? Okay. So sorry, but no, the last mile is a challenge, and ideas that are being bounced around. There's the 5G, so we can't forget cellular as a part of this equation. I think many people, when we talk about connectivity, forget that that's also an avenue that's out there. And we've actually in our county been talking about a couple of different things that may be a way to use ARPA funds or the infrastructure funds is to build towers that are, if you will, county owned, and say to teleproviders and internet providers, we'll let you hang your stuff on our equipment. We invest in that tower. So that's an infrastructure investment that we can maybe do the upfront costs, and then they can hang their stuff on it and now be able to reach, because the wireless internet technology has really come a long ways. And, I was visiting with a provider and he says, if I have a clear line of sight, I can go 50, 60 miles, with good, now with our topography, you can't always get a good line of sight, but you build a tower on a hill and now you can put a cell phone on there, you can put an internet on there, and now we can help fill in that last mile. Because most people have scratchy cell service at the end of the service. Anybody's driven, it's not even good on the interstate, so we know it's not imperfect, but that's an idea that has been bounced around for how do we do that last mile. The other part that I don't think we can solve, but it's also, do you have the right computer you can't do a real good education component I can't even get there just on your phone. You've got to have a big screen, and a lot of people do, and it may be generational. My son can sign documents on his phone. I've got to pull it up on my big screen to do it. So we also have to make sure they have the ability to use it at that end. The education component was a big part of the kids at home at school might have a phone that had internet, but that's not a great way to do a lesson plan. So there's more to it, but I think that last mile investment also is a huge economic development driver because of the quality of life that goes with it. And this work at home that is going to become a new standard lets people come to Wyoming, young families and others, and it may help the childcare issue because we might be able to work at home a little bit and be able to bounce around and take care of kids in between getting our job done, depending whether it's an interactive job. So getting that built out will be, it hits all those stools of economic development, quality of life, childcare, education, recreation, all those things. So it's another critical component that I think we've done a really good job on expanding. We've got some more room, but I'm pretty excited that it's much better than it was, but there's still those pockets of last mile that's going to be difficult.
Well, and it's been a really good example, it feels to me, like where there's been a lot of strategic thinking and a lot of work that was going into it before we even headed into the pandemic. And so then there were obviously all of these great uses that we didn't see before that really not only showed us how it could be used, but also where the gaps were, which I think positions everybody really well to be like, oh yes, I understand why that last mile is so important right now. And I think Director Schmidt, you brought up telehealth. Telehealth, it seems to me, has been an incredibly important component that people have gotten a lot more comfortable with over the course of the pandemic, whether they wanted to or not. And it might also represent an opportunity for us to be thinking about how to address the mental health challenges, because that's something else that you all brought up in your report. And I imagine that as with all these other components, it affects you and your teams in very different ways. So I would be curious if you could each talk a little bit about what the strike team talked about in terms of mental health and what maybe some ideas that percolated up in terms of how we address that for the state. Director Cooley, would you mind going first on that one?
Sure, I would be happy to. This is another issue that came up at another council meeting that I was at. Mental health is critical to our education and our workforce, right? You can't have a workforce that is ready to show up to work, ready to be safe, do the job the way it needs to be done. If their mental health is at issue, if they have substance abuse issues, if there's these other types of issues that they've got to deal with. So again, I just think that this, when we look at things, we can fix all of the alignment issues that we can. But if we don't have this healthy workforce underlying that and ready to go to work, are we just spinning our wheels with some of our efforts? So it's a kind of just a baseline, another one of those baseline things that I think we need to address to the best that we can, and make sure that we recognize the issue in Wyoming and do what we can with some of these funds to address it.
Well, and Director Schmidt, how would your department recommend? I mean, I apologize. Like this is the intractable problem in our state, and as you said, Director Cooley, it undergirds everything else in a really meaningful way. And it obviously impacts workers, it impacts families, it impacts towns and counties. And when we don't have the infrastructure that we need to address mental health, that's a real challenge. I don't expect you to solve it here, but any suggestions you have or any discussions that came up as you and the strike team moved through this would, I think, really help our listeners think about, what they can be advocating for in their communities to help their neighbors.
Okay, that's a really loaded question. And again, not to kind of continue to repeat, but it's multi-leveled and it's multi-systemic. And it's not just about one particular population, it's about all the populations. I mean, nobody's immune to it. Socioeconomic status doesn't keep you immune from mental health and substance abuse issues. So I think that's one of the conversations that we've been having, kind of what Director Cooley was suggesting, is that there really is this whole health approach to be looking at in our communities, that it's not for people who maybe struggle with employment or maybe are involved in some of the more benefit programs that we offer, but that we really need to be thinking about mental health and substance abuse from a larger perspective. The amount of feedback that we received as we were seeking information about this whole idea around what are the problems that we're trying to solve as a state, mental health and substance abuse came up repeatedly. And we see it in very real ways. We see it in our suicide rate. I mean, we have a high suicide rate. That's always first and foremost on a lot of our minds about what are we doing. So I think the first thing is that we're just cognizant and we just don't let go of it, right? That it's something that we continue to talk about. We try to look for ways to talk about it in healthy ways, that it's not pushed to the side, but that we're really addressing it. Because once we kind of let it slide out a little bit, we're really gonna then lose whatever momentum. And to kind of echo a little bit what Commissioner Willix was saying, is it's one step forward. It's a base hit. We're not going to hit home runs. We have a workforce issue. Certainly we're a mental health shortage area. So finding people who can actually provide the services is always going to be a challenge. So we know we have need, but we have tremendous issues with just having a workforce that can serve that need. We have funding issues. That's a big part of it, as the state budget has taken a hit and as many people are struggling. It's interesting that that's one of the few places where we do invest. And so when we don't have money to invest, we have to decrease. At the same time, you see need going up. So we're always in this balancing act of trying to maximize or use what we have available to us in a way that it serves a lot of people. And that's the ARPA discussion. So telehealth, how do we get telehealth to people? And it's not just about having the technology, it's also having a skill set that can use the technology. We can buy somebody a computer and we can put it down in front of them, but that doesn't mean they can use it, right? So we have to think of the whole system of utilization of these additional tools that we have and take into consideration if it's somebody who didn't grow up in an environment of this, right? I mean, I'm catching up to my kids and I'm even better than one of them in some ways, but that it's because I recognize I have to have the skill set in order to engage. And there's many people who don't. So it's that developing that comfort level with the technology and then being able to further that out into those crucial services around mental health, substance use disorders. And the state, I think, has always done a great job, and I appreciate the legislature as well. It's always been a topic of conversation. There's always been a willingness to address it. We just really struggle with how, considering who we are and the resources we have.
Well, I think, oh, go ahead, Commissioner Willicks. I always
Well,
assume if you're unmuting, it's time for,
Well,
it's
I
time for
just
people
didn't
to
know if you were
talk.
going to
That's
come
what I
to me
learned
with
in
a
Zoom.
different question. You want me to jump in, but the mental health one, you're hearing on this, Pat, we're really good at identifying the problems. But none of them have easy solutions. I mean, none of them, what we've talked about, actually broadband's the easiest solution because it's brick and mortar and wires, and that's an easy one. You know, the soft issues are harder, but mental health at the local level is really our biggest challenges are what's called Title 25. And that's short-term people that are danger to themselves or others that may have a short-term issue. And we don't have enough resources in the state. And so one of the big ideas, again, the governor has said, let's look at big ideas. It doesn't mean everything fits. I mean, we throw something to the wall and see, is more regional healthcare centers. Evanston, you know, for long-term, but it's regional, it's not regional. The others that are around there, there's WBI and Casper, there's a few others, but one of the more successful ones is in the Bighorn Basin. They've developed a mental health center that's kind of a regional one. Could we copy that and build regional mental health centers? But then you have to staff them. And as Director Schmidt said, it's hard to get that staffing, but if you can deal with some of those mental health issues on the local level is really short term that we see the issues more. It affects our jail population, affects our hospital population, but that's one where we find our biggest challenges. And they increased during COVID because of the stresses that people were under. And again, and then when you couldn't get people into those facilities because they were locked down because of the healthcare issues, then how do we can telehealth be a way to do good mental health? And it probably helps in some areas, but it isn't the answer in others. So all of these issues are easy to identify. They are extremely difficult to solve, or we'd have them figured out already. And that's just the truth. We just keep working at them and hope to improve the situation for, you know, the people around us.
Well, and in this whole discussion, I feel like what you've all lifted up is that the answers are going to have to be creative. They're going to have to be incremental. They're going to have to be sustainable, obviously, and that they're really all intersecting, right? As you're talking about mental health, it's clear that there is a piece of that is related to broadband. As you're talking about childcare, there's a piece of that is related to workforce development. I mean, all of these things are pretty much inextricably bound. And I think you've done a really good job highlighting for our audience exactly how complicated it is, but that also, you know, as we improve in each of these areas, it's going to have an exponential effect because it's going to impact out from just that really isolated, siloed topic. And knowing that we just have a few minutes before we need to wrap up, I'd love to have each of you sort of in 60 seconds, describe your vision for Wyoming and what one thing that you would love to prioritize to help us get there would be. Commissioner Willicks, I'm going to start with you.
It's not that simple either. But I do believe, you know, I think what all of us want is kind of the aggregate of what we've talked about. We want a healthy environment for people to live and work. And that means different things to different people. But we need to create an environment, and that is a work environment, an outdoor environment, an education environment, a healthcare environment that welcomes people and retains people in our state so that we can continue to be healthy and thrive and as we move forward in a sustainable way. And the problem is what I believe that looks like is different than what others do. And that brings back with the legislative, executive, and local government on this strike team. We're not all in full agreement of what the future looks like either yet, but we are committed to moving forward with it. So I didn't give you specifics, but it's very general. We want that environment that is the right one for people to come to Wyoming, stay in Wyoming, and enjoy.
I love that answer. And I have to say, on the one hand, you were on the spot to go first. On the other hand, you might have just stolen the answer from both directors. So Director Cooley, I'd be curious your response.
Well, I'm going to look at this from the workforce education standpoint. And, you know, the governor set up the workforce innovation partnership through UW and the community colleges. And I've been listening for years about how there's not been that collaboration and that working together to build that chronology that I talked about earlier, where you really build on and help individuals move through that system into a good job out into the workforce. So I think that's a good first start for that. And to me, that's the ideal for Wyoming and Wyoming workforce, is to develop that chronology for people so that they become interested in jobs in Wyoming and they ultimately end up in good jobs in Wyoming. So I think that's it for me.
Well, thank you. And Director Schmidt, will you bring us home?
I'll try to, but yes, to certainly echo what both of my colleagues have stated. I think what I would like to add to that is that we're interested in all families and all communities, and that has been the inspiration that I've kind of have from all of the conversations we had around Survive, Drive, and Thrive, is that there really is a heart for looking at the total community and not just components of it. And that attitude of wanting to create environments where people want to live and want to raise their families and want to age and want to see their families grow up here too, I think is just incredibly important. And if we can keep that at the very front of our thinking all the time, I think we're going to continue to see some really good things and continue then to open more doors with that approach.
Well, I just want to say thank you all so much for lifting up the report, for helping us understand what it is, and really for making clear that there is a strong vision for the future of the state, and that there are already resources and people working on those resources. I see people in the chat suggesting that they'd like to get more involved. So we'll be sure to send out resources tomorrow when we follow up with folks. But I just want to say thank you all for taking the time to talk to us about this. And we really appreciate it. And with that, I'm going to hand it off to Anna, who's going to wrap us up.
Awesome. And like Jen said, we will be sending a follow-up email with tons of resources. So stay tuned for that. And as of always, thanks for joining the People's Review Live. The Equality State Policy Center is a 501c3 nonpartisan nonprofit organization. We rely on charitable gifts to fund all of our work. Donations can be made on the web at equalitystate.org or by mailing a check to 419 South 5th Street, Laramie, Wyoming, 82070. Again, you can email me if you would like to join our Leadership Circle donors, which is Marcia Kunstill and Joe Albright, Mike Shaughnessy and Kathy Jenkins, Joanne Skyam True and Shane True, and an anonymous donor. Our thanks to them for making tonight possible. If you'd like to help sponsor the series, let us know. If you want to sign up for the newsletter, action alerts, or make a donation, use the web address in the chat. And as always, thanks so much for joining us, and we'll see you at the next People's Review Live, where we'll be tackling more great topics. Have a great night.
Thanks so much, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.